Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janielle Edmonds. I'm the Communications Director for State Senator Art Haywood. Thank you for joining us today. First, we will get started with opening remarks from Senator Haywood. You may begin.
Thank you. Unfortunately, January 6, 2021 was a dark and tragic day in our nation's history. Former President Trump encouraged a mob of armed insurrectionists to attack the US Capitol and overturn the results of fair elections in order to keep himself in power. Incitement of this violence caused 9 deaths and injured nearly 140 members of law enforcement. Earlier this year, I hosted a commemoration ceremony to honor the sacrifices of the fallen officers and recognize the bravery of the congresspersons who persevered. No one is above the law. Elected officials in the United States also take an oath of office to support the constitutions and be servants to the people. No person engaged in the January 6th attack on the US Capitol or who support the enemies of our democracy should be allowed on ballots for public office. Today, I have introduced Senate Resolution 657. It is historic. What it does is, once passed, would be to require the Secretary of the Commonwealth to enforce the constitutional and statutory requirements for the qualifications of candidates running for public office in Pennsylvania. This resolution urges the Secretary to enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution to disqualify any candidate from the ballot from any office who have taken an oath to support the Constitution and yet then engage in insurrection against the very government for which they swore the oath, the US government. Our third president, Thomas Jefferson, expressed the ideal concept of public office by stating, a public office is a public trust, which means public officers are entrusted with the power to protect the people. They are to hold this power in trust, use it only for the benefit of the people and never use it to benefit just themselves. And that public officers must never conduct their own personal affairs that then may infringe on the public interest. Therefore, elected officials must abide by the Constitution and laws of these United States of America. For all levels of elected governments in Pennsylvania, Congress, governor, lieutenant governor, all those in the General Assembly, attorney general, judges, court office, district judges, candidates must demonstrate that they meet the qualifications for holding public office, such as age and citizenship. Elected officials have sworn and do swear an oath to this nation. Now, the brief history of these requirements for following the oath of office and being disqualified for not following the oath of office and engaging in insurrection come out of the Civil War, when we had to make sure that Confederates would, after losing the war, would comply with the new order. Now, recently, a New Mexico judge ordered the removal of a county commissioner, removed him from office for his participation in the January 6th insurrection. This is the first time since 1869 such a removal has occurred. Want to get directly to my legislation, which is only for the purpose of preserving our democracy, and I call upon all patriots to support it. First, it will apply to all Pennsylvania office holders, up and down the ballot, local, county, state. Next, it makes it clear that current or former public officials who took an oath of office to defend the United States in their office, whatever their public office may be, that should they have engaged in insurrection, they will be barred from office and elections here in Pennsylvania. This is a current threat. Political violence from January 6th and those who were fomenting it are still around. They are still a threat to our nation, potentially a threat following this November 8th election. This resolution is a critical step to protect the rule of law, to protect that elections are the vehicle to decide who wins and who loses in Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for spending time with us in this press event. And as Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Now I'm glad to at this point introduce John Boniface, President of Free Speech for People. John, go ahead.
Senator, thank you. I'm pleased to be with you at this press briefing today. Free Speech for People is a national nonprofit public interest organization dedicated to defending our democracy and our Constitution all across the country. Last year, we launched a campaign to uphold Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That's the critical constitutional provision to protect our republic, which makes clear that anyone who takes an oath of office to defend the Constitution and then engages in insurrection or gives aid or comfort to it is forever barred from holding public office again. Senator Haywood's resolution is a critical step forward in ensuring that the mandate of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is followed. Every Secretary of State, every chief election official across the country has a duty, a responsibility to ensure that those who seek to appear on their state ballots meet the qualifications for the office for which they seek. And that includes the qualification under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment of not having taken an oath of office and then engaged in insurrection. And today, after the January 6th insurrection in 2021, we face the real prospect of candidates seeking to appear on the Pennsylvania state ballot and other state ballots who are disqualified under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And it falls to the Secretaries of State and the chief election officials across the nation to ensure that the mandate of that constitutional provision is followed. As Senator Haywood said, this provision was enacted as part of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. It was designed initially to address ex-Confederates who were in positions of government power or sought to attain positions of government power. And it made clear that they were barred from holding future public office again. In fact, many ex-Confederates were removed from office as a result of the enactment of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. 150 years later, we now have the second insurrection in our nation's history, and it must be applied again to those who took an oath of office and engaged in that insurrection, including the insurrectionist in chief, Donald Trump, should he decide to run for president. Again, he is disqualified based on the role he played in inciting the January 6th insurrection and giving aid and comfort to it. At Free Speech for People, we launched a series of historic challenges this year to candidates seeking to be on the ballot in North Carolina, Madison Cawthorn, Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Arizona, Paul Gosar, Andy Biggs, and Mark Fincham. We won critical court precedent in the North Carolina and Georgia cases that establishes that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment can be applied to the modern day insurrectionists, and that in fact will be applied for future cases we intend to bring against Donald Trump should he decide to run for president again. But separate and apart from any voter challenges that may emerge, the secretaries of state, the chief election officials across the country, they are the ones who are there to enforce this mandate. And we fully support Senator Haywood's resolution to ensure that the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania does her duty to enforce this mandate of this critical constitutional provision. Thank you.
I think that we are now open for questions. I do see one from Justin, City and State, where he's asking the question, who would determine whether a candidate is an insurrectionist? And that is under the duty of the chief elected official for the state, and for our state, that's the Secretary of State.
That's right. And she has both the responsibility and the authority to make that determination. And frankly, based on the overwhelming evidence that's been amassed by the House Select Committee on the January 6th insurrection in Congress, and all the video evidence that we have of what transpired, including Donald Trump inciting the mob of that day, the evidence is overwhelming that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection on January 6th and must be held accountable under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
I do see another question about whether this resolution would apply to the alternate electors who attempted to produce another slate of electors for consideration by Congress. And my resolution only applies to those who have sworn an oath to the Constitution already. So if an elector was also a local or state office holder, then this would apply. But if the elector was just an everyday citizen who was not an officer, who had not a public official, who had not sworn an oath to the Constitution, then this resolution does not apply to that person, everyday citizens. Those who have sworn the oath to the Constitution have a special duty to uphold the Constitution. It is an oath that we take seriously, that I take seriously, that all patriots and office holders should take seriously in terms of what is the top duty, our number one duty of office holding. And that number one duty can never be compromised by any type of personal desire to take power through insurrection or political violence.
Thank you, Justin from City and State, for your question, as well as David Payne from Radio PA Network. If any other reporters have a question, please identify your name and your organization in the chat, and as well as your question. So we'll give that about another minute or so. And if we don't have any more questions, we will wrap up.
I'll just add, Senator, that to our knowledge in tracking this work around the country, this is the first such state legislative resolution to be introduced, ensuring that a Secretary of State will enforce the mandate of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So it's a very important first step to ensuring, again, that this provision is defended. And I hope that your colleagues in other state legislatures follow suit.
Certainly, yeah, certainly hope so, as well as that we get the support of my colleagues in the General Assembly. I do want to acknowledge that there are individuals beyond the former president who did engage in the insurrection in our Commonwealth. And this resolution to have them disbarred would disqualify them as well once this is passed, and should the Secretary of State take the action that we are seeking under this resolution. So, and it's not just the individuals who are involved with January 6th. I am unfortunately aware that we have a current political threat. There may be office holders who engage in insurrection in the months and weeks to come. And hopefully this resolution will put them on notice that should they engage in such action, their chances of them losing office have increased.
Okay, we now have a question from David Payne from Radio PA Network. He asks, have you been in touch with the Secretary of State, and what, if any, has been the reaction to your resolution?
Yes, I have been in touch with the Acting Secretary of State, Leah Chapman. It is her view from lawyers that she has that a conviction by a court is required before she could execute the disqualification. The conviction by a court is the example from New Mexico. And that's the position of her lawyers. Now, as you know, there are more than one lawyers. Many lawyers take positions on issues at hand. And while that is their position, that is not shared by me or John. And so that's why we are following through with this resolution.
I also just add, Senator, thank you for that in fact, the judge in the New Mexico case who removed that county commissioner from office, in his ruling, he stated very clearly that a criminal conviction is not required to apply Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It is true that that county commissioner had been convicted, but that was not the basis on which he was removed. He was removed because the judge independently found that he was disqualified under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment from serving in office. His ruling mirrors a ruling that we had won at Free Speech or People before an administrative law judge in our case against Marjorie Taylor Greene earlier this year in Georgia. That judge also ruled that no criminal conviction is necessary. And if you look at the legislative history of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and the actual text of the provision, it's also clear that no criminal conviction is necessary to apply the mandate of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. If that had been the requirement, then Jefferson Davis would have been able to run for public office after the Civil War. He was prohibited from doing so. All of the Confederate elites who had not even engaged in taking up arms, but were ordering the war on their end, all of those Confederate elites were barred under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So there's really no basis for this legal argument under the legislative history, the text of the provision, nor under the recent rulings that have occurred in Georgia and in New Mexico.
We may want to clarify that Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, for those who don't have the same Civil War history that John has.
We have another question from Jan Murphy with Penn Live. Jan asks, why offer this resolution now, given the few days left in the calendar? How realistic are its chances of receiving consideration by Senate Republican leaders, given how the dismissed Senator Mastriano's attendance to the events at the Capitol on January 6th?
I propose this legislation because I am a patriot. I believe that the oath of office that I took should apply, and that those who form an insurrection should be required to follow the Constitution. It is my duty to try to persuade my colleagues of the same position. A number of my colleagues are proposing legislation now, and some are waiting until December when we start the new session. But it's been my experience in the General Assembly that as the sooner you introduce an idea into the conversation, the better, because it takes some time for legislation to pass. And this is also, as I shared, a signal to those who might be interested in engaging in insurrection this year or during the new year, prior to the new session, that we have a current request out to the Secretary of State. We are also making the case to the Secretary of State so that possibly she would take this action without being compelled to do so by the passage of this resolution. So that is my answer as to why now is always the time to do what's right. And yes, it is my duty to persuade my colleagues to go along with me, as well as the Secretary of State.
Thanks so much, Senator. It looks like there are no more questions in the chat. If neither of you have any closing remarks, we will conclude the press conference. Media, if you do have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me or Edward Erickson from Free Speech for People. Both of our contact information was in the media advisory. Thank you to both of our speakers. Do either of you have any final remarks?
John, I give you an opportunity for some final remarks before I share mine.
Well, thank you, Senator. My only final remarks would be that we have a crisis in our democracy today after the January 6th insurrection, and it's critical that the Constitution be defended including Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So again, we applaud you for introducing this resolution and for ensuring that the mandate of that critical constitutional provision is enforced.
Thank you, John, and thank you for your leadership on this critical issue to save our nation from those who would try to destroy it through political violence. The time to do what's right is always now. Thank you.